Mingalaba, for any Burmese language speakers tuning in today, we wanted to let you know that our Better Burma mission has launched 3 Burmese language podcasts: Myanmar Revolutionary Tales, Dark Era of Burma, and Myanmar Peace, Women, and Security. These programs can be found on our website as well as on any of your preferred podcast platforms. We invite you to take a listen. But for now, let's get on with this episode.
All right, and welcome back. My guest today is a veteran of the United Nations with, I believe, some 20 years experience. Charles Petrie has recently published, well, he's published multiple articles, but has recently traveled inside Myanmar, has traveled to Karenni State, and has written about his experiences in an article which is entitled A Journey into Rebel-Held Myanmar, published on Noema. And we will be delving into both the realities on the ground in Myanmar as well as the broader international space and the United Nations more specifically. But before we get into that, Charles, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us and giving us your time and your insights. And I'd like to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself for our audience.
No, thank you very much. So as you mentioned, my name is Charles Petrie. I served 20 years with the UN, but then before that, also worked with Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, and then after resigning from the UN in 2010, continued working in conflict and post-conflict situations. As you said, I've just come. Well, I came out of Myanmar earlier this year, and I went in because I was very interested by sort of the new dynamics that we that are emerging in Myanmar, the new governance dynamics that we'll be discussing. In terms of who I am, I think I have had sort of a traditional career within NGOs in the UN in terms of um, humanitarian aid, humanitarian action, humanitarian operations. But I was in Rwanda during the genocide. I was the deputy humanitarian coordinator for the UN, and I also was confronted with this notion of evil, an absolute form of horror, if you want. I also spent 2 years in the Middle East, based in Gaza, and then 3 years as a senior UN official responsible for initiating and maintaining contacts with Congolese rebels. So my, let's say, the other dimension of my professional development has been trying to get a better sense of absolute horror and what brings people to do it, which then brings out the third dimension of my professional development, which is the attempt to get the UN to investigate one of its own alleged to have participated in the act of genocide. So and basically that's why I resigned from the UN in 2010. I was the Secretary General's representative in Burundi, and I resigned because this individual had basically all efforts to try and get this individual to account for his actions, his alleged actions, failed and the UN was a major cause of that failure. So I felt I could no longer represent the organization. And I remember waking up one morning at 2 a.m. and realize, or thinking to myself, if I don't resign from the UN today, the day I die, I will resign from the UN. So I resigned from the UN. And then my involvement in Myanmar, I was the UN representative in Myanmar from 2003 to 2007, got PNG'd, kicked out of the country by the authorities for supporting the monks. And then after I'd left the UN in 2010, in 2012, a number of these same authorities who had kicked me out asked me to come back to help facilitate the dialogue between the armed groups and the military, which I did between 2012 to 2015. With a number, I built a team, the Myanmar Support Initiative, with a number of fantastic individuals. And then 2015, in my view, the whole ceasefire process collapsed, and then subsequently have been following Myanmar since the coup, and have been engaged regularly with some of the CDM leaders, and which ultimately led me to spending those 5 weeks in Myanmar.
Mm. I mean, I just want to take a look at a slight step back there, because I think you're being quite modest when you say you have a sort of regular or normal upbringing through the NGO United Nations. Well, because I mean, I'm reading off your Wikipedia page, because I don't know your life story that closely, unfortunately. But from what I'm seeing, like you were heading up the emergency unit in Sudan. You were in Afghanistan as a advisor to a pretty senior Afghan minister after the initiation of the war against by the United States. So it seems that you have a career that has taken you to some of the most extreme circumstance. Like you mentioned Rwanda, you mentioned the Congo. It seems that your career has not been soft. You haven't been dealing with breakdowns in communication. You've been dealing with genuine crises on an enormous scale. Was that intentional on your part? Did you seek out these postings? Did you seek out these situations and circumstances, or did they just sort of follow you somehow?
No, I was definitely driven. Yeah, yeah. I mean, when I say regular, I think there are a number of us who have this sort of career. I think there are different motivations, of course. But no, I was after Rwanda. I was definitely driven. I was driven to try to. I mean, in a way, for me, when I arrived in Rwanda in May '94, so just a month after the genocide started, and it lasted 100 days. I'd already, I'd been involved, as you said, in Sudan, and then I was also in Somalia, and I was in Somalia during that whole Black Hawk Down incident. So I was in Mogadishu for almost a year and a half, but when I arrived in Myanmar, no, not Myanmar, when I arrived in Rwanda, it was the dynamics of violence were noticeably different, and it was this sort of small political group known as the Akazu that unleashed a level of violence that was, unprecedented in a way, where it's confrontation between Hutus and Tutsis. I mean, it's frequently seen in that light. I see it much more as as an attempt by a small group who happened to be Hutu majority, who wanted to retain and retain power in the country. And so they unleashed the violence where every Hutu killed was killed for a specific reason. There was some grievance against the individual that contributed to this individual's murder, whether it be having been part of the opposition, being too soft on the Tutsis, or there could even be venal things like um, debts or jealousies and the rest. But every Hutu killed was killed for a specific reason, while the Tutsis were killed for just the simple reason that they were on earth, that they had been born. and that violence you really felt. You saw the fear, you felt the fear, you saw the irrationality of the barriers, the checkpoints, with the people manning the checkpoints. It was, and that really shocked me, and it drove a number of my decisions, and also, number of postings that I actually sought to try and really get a better sense, a better understanding of, being in Rwanda was almost like, violence is violence and it's awful, and war is awful, and the rest. And but in a way, there's almost a certain logic to it, a horrible logic, but something like, the violence that was unleashed in Rwanda sort of defied that logic. And so I almost felt like those of us who were in Rwanda at the time were privileged spectators to, so we were looking at the bowels of a monster. And that when you stepped out of Rwanda, all of a sudden the veil came back down and you almost forgot that it existed. So Rwanda, Rwanda definitely, coming out of Rwanda, I was driven by the desire to try and understand what was it that allowed people to do what was done in Rwanda.
And I think it's a very interesting and a very important point that you raise, because you're completely correct. Those of us on the outside who are not particularly familiar with it, we learn it as the Rwanda genocide was a conflict between the Hutus and the Tutsis. We learn it in these very simplistic terms that there are two different conflicting ethnic groups and they don't like each other, and so they're trying to exterminate each other. And people who are outside of these conflicts would look, I think, in very simplistic binary terms at the conflict between Sudan and South Sudan, would look in the same simplistic terms at conflicts that are happening right now across Congo, would look even at the conflict in the Balkans in very simplistic terms, where we like to simplify things down. We like to say, well, it's this ethnic group and that ethnic group, or it's religious violence. And I think history teaches us that a lot of the lasting conflicts and instability in the post-colonial countries comes from the fact that the British and the French colonial overlords had a tendency to view countries as easily divisible, either by language category or by ethnic category or by religious category, and they didn't actually look at the underlying structures and the underlying tensions and the self-identification of different peoples. And I mean, what you said, that it was a predominantly Hutu group doing the violence, not that it was the Hutus, but it was a predominantly Hutu group. I mean, even that just reminded me of the Taliban in Afghanistan, which is not the same thing as the Pashtun people. They happen to be a majority Pashtun organization, but of course it's not fair to characterize the conflict in Afghanistan as the Pashtuns don't like the Tajik, even though that is often what it is simplified down to. Do you find that there is this tendency to want to seek out some very simple overarching identifier and turn complicated conflicts into a simple binary of this group of people and that group of people? And if you do, why do you think it is that people do not seem to look for the actual underlying causes and the actual underlying realities and motivations of the conflict, and like to go back to this group doesn't like that group and that's the reason for the fighting?
Well, I mean, yeah. Well, just to start, I agree. I think there's frequent, the tensions that exist in societies are frequently seen as causes for the violence rather than a favorable context in which violence can take hold. Um, and that's where, like you, other contexts, you have, for me, ultimately everything's about politics, and it's and it's political, and a political act to strike a match and light the fire, which actually, to be honest, we're seeing now in the UK with these violent anti-immigrant protests. and individuals that have been identified, some of them living in Cyprus, who are, lighting the fire through social media. So I think there's a frequently the internet, those involved in these contexts confuse cause and context in these situations, cause and context. Then your broader question, I well, I think I think there's I don't know. Well, there's sort of a number of different factors. I think there's the lack of intellectual rigor that a lot of policy makers bring to a situation. Simplification makes it also a lot easier to write about. Uh, um, um, I think, on the other side of the same coin, there's also a tendency to believe in fairy tales. So on the other side, and that we'll get to, I think, when we look at Myanmar. I think Myanmar suffered from the fairy tale delusion of the West. But no, otherwise, I think it's just sort of a tendency to simplify also because it makes it a lot easier to write the papers, the short papers for senior officials who need to take decisions, um, and and uh, and also the fact that one has it. I mean, it's I'm sort of almost rambling to your to as an answer to your question, because it's also, the tendency of bad guy, good guy, bad guy, good group, bad group. So I think there are a whole sort of basically, I would say, lazy. It's a lazy approach to analyzing a context and violence. The violence.
But so you've been personally involved in a very large number of. I mean, this is if you ask me to write down a list of the most horrific conflicts of the last 30, 40 years, I mean, you've been at most of the conflicts at the top of the list, if not all of the conflicts at the top of the list. I mean, okay, maybe like you weren't in Tigray or something like that, but you've been involved in these really, really extreme situations, so you would have that inside view. And I think this is something that we don't get to understand enough. We do occasionally see media being called out for oversimplifying, and we sometimes see parody media writing reports on Western political changes and Western political developments in the style that Western media use to talk about developments in non-Western countries, to say, well, this is what it looks like if you simplify the American election cycle down to a sectarian conflict between, Republicans and Democrats or something like this. But I'm wondering, would you be in a position to say that this type of reporting has actually contributed tangible harm, either in terms of inflaming tensions, or even in terms of dissuading potential supporters, potential allies from engaging with the crisis, because it paints the crisis in a light that does not make it appealing to those people who would otherwise be in a position to help?
Yeah, well, I think all of the points you make are correct. I think, the media and media sort of continues now. I mean, it is, there's sort of the conventional wisdom approach to a Western conventional wisdom approach to many situations that, and then of course you have interest. I mean, I don't know if it I think I don't know if it sort of does harm. I think it definitely complicates, and through complication, of course, introduces a level of harm. But I think the real harm is the nature of the violence and this and the suffering inflicted on populations. But yeah, no, I think there. I mean, it's basically, the way I see it now, and it's not in a jaded, cynical way. I see it as that's the way things are. Huh? This is the real world, and it's a real world, and I guess the one thing we need to be willing let go is the notion that Father Christmas exists, or that the Seventh Cavalry will always come in. So this notion that the press will always be independent and objective, that truth will always triumph, and that ultimately there will be justice. These are all, I mean, fantastic concepts and fantastic beliefs to have, and I think we many of us have them, but I've come to the point in my life where I actually think they're not correct, or they're not givens. That if you want them, you have to fight for them, and you have to stand up for them as an individual.
And it's not just the media then, because let's sort of turn to your Myanmar experiences. As I'm sure we're about to get into, even the United Nations, as large an organization as it is, and as dedicated to truth and facts as it is, does sort of suffer from this problem as well. So you you refer to it as being PNG'd, and I love that there is a shorthand for this in diplomatic circles. I'd never heard that before, but I'm presuming that's a shortening for persona non grata. So you were expelled as a diplomat. You were expelled from Myanmar by the military regime in 2007 for supporting the monks during the Saffron Revolution. Can you just share with us that story?
Yeah. Actually, in a way, of course, I was expelled. Basically, I was expelled from Myanmar for positioning the UN with the monks. But actually, I was expelled from Myanmar for supporting a younger generation of military in Myanmar. I mean, when I was I was in Myanmar from 2003 to 2007, and it became clear that the Myanmar military, they operate in a very sort of systematic manner, and at the time they had what they called the 7-step roadmap, and it became clear that a new generation of senior officers were being groomed to take over the country. That Tan Shui and his group were looking at retirement. They needed to be assured that whomever took over would protect their old age, their future, their gains. And so they were, you really had a sense that there was a new generation of officers that were being groomed to take over. And then I tried to maintain contact with as many of the leadership as I could, to try and explain to them that the situation in Myanmar, at least on a socioeconomic sense, was dire, and of course human rights sense was dire. And so when the revolt happened, and basically what triggered the monks' revolt was the dramatic increase in fuel prices, and specifically sort of the 500% increase in compressed natural gas, in the price of compressed natural gas, which was significant because all of the public transport in the urban centers the buses were run on compressed natural gas. So overnight, the fares doubled, and the people just couldn't take the buses anymore. They were so vulnerable economically. And so the monks went into the streets, and basically their message to the military is, stop insulting the people. They can't take it anymore. And they said that they knew it because on the one hand, their alms, the donations going to the monasteries were significantly decreasing, but secondly, all of a sudden they were receiving a lot of kids in their monastic schools. So they, and for a while, and it shocked the military, because one of the pillars of their legitimacy had always been their faith, their Buddhist faith. So that the monks would turn against the military, or would actually first go into the streets, was a shock. And then it took a while because it was really complicated. But at one point, the military, the SPDC at the time, found an opening to attack the monks, and they did, and it was very, very violent repression. And during that whole time, I would go see the generals and the people the relationship or the people I developed a relationship with, and I would tell them, actually listen to the monks. What they're saying is not false, and we've been trying to tell you this for at least the last 5 years that I've been in country. And of course the violence, and then it kept on progressing. And then at one point, I think it was towards the end of September, I realized that the violence wasn't going to stop anytime soon, and that I would find myself on the 24th of October, which was UN Day. I would find myself reading a speech, the Secretary General's speech, so a speech that would be given to me from New York, and I knew that the speech was about global warming. So I would be reading a speech on UN Day on global warming in the midst of some sort of, in the midst of the word horrific, but I don't want to use the word horrific too many times, but in the midst of an extremely tense and violent situation. And so I wrote to the Secretary General's office at the end of September, and I said, very happy to read a speech, but would it be possible to place just a line for us on peaceful protests, or something on the vulnerability of populations, or something like that? And the response I got was no, because if we do it for you, well, as in if we do it for Myanmar, we'll have to do it for many other countries in the future. So they said no. But I still felt, I felt that the 24th of October was going to be a critical moment. And as much as it was essential for the UN to be seen to stand on the right side of injustice, it was equally critical for the UN not to be silent, because my fear was if we were to remain silent, we would be undercutting the confidence of this younger generation of officers, who I felt understood that what was happening was not good. So we would be undermining, no, not undercutting. We would be undermining the position of those senior military officers who were uncomfortable with what was happening. And so with a few colleagues and friends, we decided that we wrote a speech, and I presented the speech to the rest of the UN system in Myanmar, and I told the UN that my colleagues, UN country team, I told them that I planned to read the speech after the Secretary General's speech, and I could do it two ways. I could, if all of them stood by the speech, which was, it was already a collective effort, because I wrote it with a few colleagues. If all of the UN heads could stand by the speech, were with the speech, I would read it on behalf of the UN system. But if any of them were uncomfortable and did not want to be associated, it wasn't a problem. I would read it as the UN resident humanitarian coordinator. I also told them that I would clear the speech with headquarters. And so then I gave them a night to think it over. And the next morning, they came back, and the whole of the country team stood by the speech. So I read it. I read it on UN Day. I read the Secretary General's speech, and then I read that speech. And of course, I hadn't cleared it with New York, because it was so clear that New York would never accept it. So what I did at the time, which was very interesting, I think you can no longer do it, but at the time there was on the email, you could actually send a message to all UN staff throughout the world. There was a little function that you could tap into and do that. So I wrote to the Secretary General telling him that I'd of course read his speech, and then I'd read another one, and I included a copy of the speech. I was pretty sure I was going to get fired for what I'd done. So that's why I decided I might as well, share this moment with everybody. And within half an hour, there was a response from one of the most senior UN officials, who wrote back and said, this was the proudest moment of her life, to be associated with an organization that was willing to stand up for what was correct. And the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon. Ban Ki-moon was a really interesting person. I mean, I think he had an intrinsic understanding of what the UN represented. Was because he was South Korean, he had benefited from the UN's support when he was a young child during the Korean War, and he also accepted and congratulated me, actually, for having read that speech. So there were others within the UN who felt that I had committed the ultimate crime, that a bureaucrat should not get involved should not stand up in this way, that it wasn't our role, that we were representatives of, we were there to serve governments, and patati patata. But the main point is that the Secretary General stood by me, and I wasn't fired.
But so this thing comes to the question that I posed to you in our previous discussion, that how can it be that you have an organization where everyone, all the way up to the Secretary General himself, all of the important people in the organization, from what you're saying, not only did not punish you for what you have done, but actually said that they were proud that you did what you did. They were proud to be associated with it. They thought that it was the morally right thing to do, and they thought that it was in line with the ethos of the organization. And yet you were not able to secure permission ahead of time, because it feels like everyone that you're talking about wants your type of action, your objective, direct call out to dictatorial regimes, to repressive systems, to be a thing that happens. They want these leaders, they want these dictators, they want these military regimes to be called out by the United Nations publicly. But they don't seem to be comfortable when they're saying, if we have to do it for Myanmar, we would have to do it for these other countries. The obvious rejoinder to that is, then why don't you? Like, if all of these countries, if you recognize that their situations are so dire that they should be called out publicly, why is the United Nations not doing that?
I think they're two, when you're in the UN, there are two schools of thought as to what the UN represents and what the UN should do. So you have one school of thought, which is that the UN and the Secretary General is actually nothing more than the administrator of a world body, and that so the role of the Secretary General and the role of the UN is to serve states, because the states are coming together, and the UN is nothing more than the secretariat to a state-centric structure. And then you have another school of thought in the UN, which is that the UN actually is there to promote the charter, that the role of the UN is very much the promoter, the protector, the projection of the UN charter. So they're very, very strong principles. I think as an institution, the dominant philosophy is the first. And so, and that goes all the way up, the whole realpolitik, it leads to many jaded UN officials. But when the second is done but when the second is done and it doesn't necessarily cause overwhelming damage to the institution, or there isn't overwhelming pushback from the member states, and specifically the permanent five, then all of a sudden, of course, it's welcomed, because it feeds this sense that the UN is more than just a secretariat. What I found in the UN, in terms of these two philosophies, I found the higher up you go in the system, the more you develop this sort of realpolitik approach to states and to international world order, while at the middle level, at the lower and middle level, that's where you have a dominant, you have the greatest a commitment to the second, which is this sense of the UN is actually the guarantor of the UN Charter and the promoter of the UN Charter. So that's, I think, in sort of a structured way. And then I think the second problem that confronts the UN today is in a very perverse way. It's and of course, I benefited from it. It's the advantages that are given to UN staff, the salaries, the education, free education for children into university, um, uh, that all of those, they're and the fact that most people in the UN know that they would not be able to get the same level of remuneration and advantages outside of the UN. So then you have, if you take the first view that the UN is nothing more than a secretariat that is actually serving the member states, and that you actually don't want to upset the member states, and then you take young people who, the higher they go, the better the remuneration and the advantages, the more they realize that they're not going to get the same thing outside, the more they fall into basically the trap of the golden cage. And I think we're seeing that even more now, where the UN as a multilateral organizations have lost a lot of influence in the world order. The UN has a huge financial crisis. So these are all realities that are not incentivizing individuals to take risk within the UN, because the personal cost of taking risk is real.
I mean, I suppose I just picked up on a thing. Like you mentioned the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, and you were saying like the accolades come in after it turns out that you didn't ruffle any feathers. Are you suggesting that even though you got all these people from the United Nations all the way up to the Secretary General saying, "Oh, we're so happy, we're so proud that you did this," if, for example, Russia and China had come back and said, "Well, we protest this and we demand action, and we think this is a perversion of the UN mission," do you think that in that case those same people would have turned around and said, "Yes, you're right, this person needs to be censured, this person needs to be removed from his position, and the United Nations needs to issue an apology on this issue"? Do you think that reproach from those sort of heavy hitters within the United Nations would have changed the response that you received?
No, not Ban Ki-moon, not the Secretary General of the time, because through other occasions also, I found that he was somebody who really, as I said, had a very strong sense of what the UN should be. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, definitely, I mean, within, there were very, very senior officials in the UN who actually thought that the what I'd done was a crime of lèse-majesté, and that it shouldn't be done. I mean, the example also is, I was kicked out, and then my replacement was brought in, and he started playing golf with the generals, and that a lot of the people that had worked with me in Myanmar, who were very much sort of the backbone of our attempt, were actually sidelined. So yeah, definitely. I think I think so. The answer is no in that context because of Ban Ki-moon. I don't think he would have succumbed, but yes, generally.
Interesting. And so this, I think this brings up the fundamental question of the United Nations as an organization, because if we have this situation where you say, well, okay, the United Nations exists not to represent the best interest of the 8 billion people who exist on Earth today, and there may be 10 billion people who are going to exist on Earth within the next 50 years or the next 100 years and trying to leave the planet in a decent condition for them. But rather, the United Nations represents the 193 member states. What happens if you look around those member states and you realize, dear God, the majority of these member states are actually either officially or unofficially dictatorial or pro-dictatorial, or are trending towards taking away civil liberties, are corrupt, are deeply problematic, and are not the types of countries that are particularly interested in calling out military dictatorships, are interested in calling out corruption, are interested in calling out bad faith actors. It's not just that you have a very large number of countries that are relatively small, relatively obscure from the Western eye, where this type of behavior in government is standard, but also we have countries like Russia, countries like China, who seem to routinely skirt UN attempts to hold certain countries to a certain standard. China very famously continued trading with Chad when everybody else agreed that we should not do that, and of course China used the opportunity to undercut the market value and make bank for themselves, but kept the regime in Chad partially afloat. I'm hypersimplifying, but my point is, if you look at the members of the United Nations and you say, if a very large number of the members, including powerful members of the United Nations, are themselves regimes which are either corrupt or dictatorial or overbearing and fundamentally opposed to democratization and progress and civil liberties, and the United Nations is then viewed by its own staff as an organization which should limit itself only to serving the interests of those member states, do you get to this point where you look at the United Nations and you say, this entire enterprise is pointless? There is no reason to continue with this because it does not serve the fundamental goals that were originally there when the United Nations was created in the wake of World War II.
Yeah. Well, one I would say very strongly that no, the United Nations is not pointless. I mean, and in a way, and specifically because of what you said at the end, I think one should never forget that the United Nations came out of two horrific world wars. The United Nations being sort of a transformation in a way of the League of Nations. So I think, and it's a product of a commitment by a number of enlightened leaders to try and, well, it's a product of an understanding of a number of leaders that allowing national interests to define international agendas, allowing a Darwinian form of international world order was not very good. It did not make was not very good for peace. Was not sort of the best recipe for stability, and that there needed to be somebody that brought together nations, that set standards, and that was the United Nations. To come back to what you're saying, I would frame the current situation slightly differently. I think, or I would pose the question differently. And the way I would pose it is, what happens when the majority of, well, the P5 and sort of the powers, the big powers on the world stage, what happens when they no longer consider a multilateral approach or a body like the United Nations as being relevant in the achievement of their own goals? What happens when you have the reestablishment of a Darwinian world order, which is what we see now? Well, then what happens is that the UN is confronted with a huge challenge of relevance, and really has to fight very, very hard to claim a space, and its leadership needs to position the UN, in the most aggressive manner. It needs to position the UN in the most aggressive manner on specific issues in order to be able to get some level of relevance for the UN. But what what is the state of the UN today in this Darwinian world order, the UN's basically irrelevant.
Because it was just something that I wanted to follow on, that I think that it could potentially be a little bit worse even than what you're describing, because it feels to me that certain countries have an approach where they look at the United Nations, and you're talking about dialogue, right? You're talking about this alternative to might makes right, which I think is sort of what you're hinting at with your Darwinian politics. It seems to me that certain countries have this attitude that, well, I can just do things, and the United Nations will use dialogue. And what dialogue is wonderful for is stopping the people who are trying to control my actions from actually directly getting engaged, directly taking action, and directly preventing what I'm doing. So I get the sense that certain big fish are in a position where, and again, I always come back to Russia and China, and I know it's not entirely fair because they're P5 members and all that, but it feels to me that, and the the United States is also very much, I think, in this category, and with regards to certain actions that it has taken, where they say, like, well, the United Nations is going to sit and it's going to debate and is going to talk and is going to talk about how wonderful it is that we have diplomatic avenues. And in the meantime, these countries are doing the things that they're doing until they become a fait accompli. And then by the time the United Nations is done talking, well, it's already too late to do any action, even if they do pass a resolution to take action on the issue. Like, I may be looking at it completely incorrectly. This may not be a situation that in your experience genuinely arises, but the feeling that I sometimes get is very much this, that for a lot of countries, they want the United Nations to not fail because they see it as a valuable stalling tactic to prevent other countries from taking action, because they can say, oh, but go to the United Nations and file a formal complaint. And by the time that's done, it's too late.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of qualified that initial thought with, I see the situation, I see a worse situation. I start my response by telling you, I wish what you were saying was true. I think that's a better situation than the one we're actually in. And the one we're actually in is, it's totally, I mean, who gives a, you know, who gives anything? I mean, the UN can talk as much as it wants. I think what we've seen, especially, between, we've seen, I mean, of course, we've seen the emergence of, of might makes right, and this, and this has been going on, maybe you could say a point, or maybe around 2016, when some of the major countries, had sort of populist type governments taking over, and so yeah, mid 2000, 2000, yeah, 14, 15. But then I think since Ukraine and since Gaza, I think there's a complete there's a complete, so from 2016, the rest, then you're right, then the UN people talked about the UN basically trying to find ways of either manipulating or skirting the UN in terms of the embarrassment that it could cause. But well, since the 7th of October, I think we've that's which comes on top of Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. This sense of double standards, this sense of the erosion of a rules-based world order has meant that the UN, yes, no, I don't think anybody's too concerned by what's being discussed in the UN. I mean, these key actors are not really concerned by what the discussions are that are going on in the UN.
Mm. And so, turning a little bit more specifically to the Myanmar situation, I know that you it came up in an interview that you conducted with Irrawaddy, specifically the R2P, the responsibility to protect, and that was something that you yourself noted in that interview. The people were protesting for. There were a lot of protest signs early in 2021 asking specifically for R2P to be invoked. And And I think a very, 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 very strong case can be made that Myanmar qualified and that responsibility to protect should have been invoked. And as we know, it was not. Um, and the title of that interview as it was published is "The UN Has Failed the People of Myanmar," which is a pretty intense title. I don't know whether you or not you were involved in crafting that title, but it's a very intense statement to make. So I'm wondering, you as having been inside the UN, looking at the issue of responsibility to protect, looking at the issue of saying this is a country in crisis where a civilian population is being violently and lethally subjugated by an illegitimate military regime that has seized power in violation of its own constitution and is murdering civilians indiscriminately in such a situation, and the civilian population is begging for international intervention to help them. In such a situation, do you feel that the United Nations has the legal and operational legitimacy and capacity to take action? And more importantly, do you think that it has the cultural and political clout to actually do something in a situation like this, or are they too afraid of repercussions from other countries?
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's sort of the multiple levels of answers. I mean, the first is R2P. I think I think we during the post Cold War period, from the early late 80s, early 90s on, I think there was. I mean, there was a genuine attempt to push and promote values of protection of the individuals and instruments to protect the individuals. Sort of a sort of yeah a humane humanitarian human rights agenda, and R2P was one of the instruments that was put in place. But R2P has three components to it. It has of course the interventionist component, which is the last one, but then it has two other components, which are much more. The first is working with local governments, local authorities, local actors to get them to understand the need to address what's happening. Capacity building, reinforcing. And then the second component, which is to work with regional bodies and neighboring states to put pressure and to sort of encourage governments and authorities to act differently, and then the interventionist. But I think in a way, after the end of the Cold War, there was much of what was presented and pushed was sort of was Western dominated. I think there was a certain level of arrogance from us on the West on the rights or the goodness of what we were pushing through. And in terms of R2P, and this arrogance led to R2P, the actions or the invocations of R2P being very much focused on this last interventionist bit, as we saw in Libya. And so in that and other areas in terms of rhetoric. And that, I think, undermined the value of the tool, because it was seen by non-Western powers as just another form of Western intervention. It was a way for the West to expand its influence, and that's where when and that's the world we've come into. I think we need on the West to understand. We need to accept and to introduce a high level of humility in our understanding of our position in the world, and the understanding. We need to understand that there are other forms of other philosophies, other ways of viewing social interaction or societies. We are very much focused on the rights of an individual. Other societies are much more focused on the community and the responsibility of the individual within the community. So there are different philosophies, and we need to try and understand that. For me, the horror of or the sadness that these young CDMers, that raising the R2P banners. For me, the sadness of that act was the fact that there were so many Western politicians and government officials who were also invoking R2P, and it was so incredibly disingenuous because they knew that there would be no intervention. And yet, it was again this sort of feel good sense that we seem in the West to want. And so it was a feel good, yeah, R2P, yes, but they knew that it wasn't going to happen, that it wasn't going to be such an intervention. And I think that's the first failure of the West, is the of the international community. But the West is we're not honest enough in telling groups and people what they can genuinely expect from the international community. The the title, the UN has failed Myanmar, actually, in a way, I thought was slightly misrepresenting the discussion, because there was a lot of discussion, and it was only at the end that I made the point, which is standby, that the UN has failed Myanmar. And I think in part the UN has failed Myanmar structurally. There has not been an in-country head of the UN since the coup, since even before the coup. The individual who was the UN resident coordinator, a fantastic individual, was sick. He was receiving treatment outside, and there was no attempt to replace him at the beginning of the coup. And so since then, the UN in country has been leaderless. And so the representative of the UN body is always an individual from an agency. And that can't work in a very complex and volatile political situation, because you're asking the head of the UN to take positions on behalf of the whole system, on the part, to take courageous positions that could actually undermine the operations of the agency he or she represents. And that is asking a lot, but it's asking even more when you consider that this person's career and advancement is based on the agency's performance. And however courageous the UN takes, what agencies really look at is funding and how much how much the agency is actually able to deliver. So I think that, one of the tragedies of the UN is the fact that the UN country team in Myanmar is basically orphaned. They have no leader. They have no leader, and they're not getting the direction from New York. New York is there is not there is no senior level commitment in New York to really focus on what needs to be done in Myanmar, what needs to be done for the UN in Myanmar in order for the UN to be able to operate. And I can say this with great confidence because Ban Ki-moon, when I resigned from the UN in 2010, Ban Ki-moon invited me back, 2012, 13, to do a review of the UN's failure in Sri Lanka. And the review came out of the Ban Ki-moon when the Sri Lankan war finished. Ban Ki-moon set up a panel of independent experts, world-renowned experts, to look at what had happened and to advise him on what needed to be done. And so the panel did. They looked and they submitted a report to Ban Ki-moon, but with the report, they submitted a 7-page confidential letter. Half of the 7 pages, so half a page of the 7 pages, was the panel telling Ban Ki-moon, you're going to have to fight hard to implement the findings of this report, because there's going to be tremendous resistance from the Sri Lanka government. I mean, they're going to go really, really hard against you. The 6.5 other pages had to do with the UN's performance in Sri Lanka, and what these high level, these are world-renowned judges, very, very high level international experts who said that what they saw of the UN's performance in Sri Lanka was probably one of the worst that has ever been undertaken by the UN. And they said that they would have included, no, that it was so bad that they decided it not to include it in their report because they feared that it would detract from the core of the report, which had to do with the Sri Lankan government's responsibility. But they encouraged Ban Ki-moon to undertake an internal review of what the UN's failure in order to draw some really, really critical lessons. And Ban Ki-moon asked me to lead that review. And we produced a report that is considered one of the 3 most damning reports ever written on the UN. And and for me, one of the shocking aspects of the work was realizing that the majority of the people and the majority of senior leadership in the UN did not see protection as being their responsibility. And so the first recommendation that was given to Ban Ki-moon is to reaffirm the primacy of the UN Charter to UN staff, that protection is something that concerns all staff. And then we there were a lot of individuals who did some really bad things, a lot of senior leaders who did some really bad things in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka. And so at the time we were going to write the report, we sort of hesitated, do we focus on individual failure? But then we realized that actually individuals were allowed to fail because of this systemic nature of the organization that allowed it. So then we focused on the systemic failure of the UN in such situations. And what was written in the report was that when you have a crisis like Sri Lanka, like Myanmar today, the Secretary General has to immediately name a senior UN official responsible for managing the crisis. Because what you need, the UN is made up of many different components. You have the political, humanitarian, human rights, development. Yeah. And what you have in the UN when you don't have this senior level leadership is you have competing strategies. And you have strategies and approaches that actually end up negating the effect of each other or undermining each other. So you need a senior UN official responsible for, one, the elaboration of a system-wide strategy for the country, but then responsible for calibrating the responses. So you at a certain time, you need to push the human rights point up front, but it doesn't mean that the other efforts aren't done. You find ways of calibrating that. And that right now, I think that's the fundamental failure right now of the UN's response in Myanmar, is that there has not been ownership, has not been claimed at the senior level in New York. And as a result, you can have a situation where the UN country team is orphaned, where where there's no leader even in country to take difficult positions, because those who are in the interim positions are taking difficult positions on the part of the UN that will undermine the work of the agency they represent. So they're not going to do it.
But I mean, it's a little bit disheartening what you're saying, because you're talking about, that you were asked to undertake an investigation. You wrote this very damning report about the United Nations failures. And I think that's very admirable. And I think that any organization that takes itself seriously has to be critical of itself. It has to recognize that it is not perfect. It has mistakes. It has to accept those mistakes and try to rectify them. But the issue to me is the United Nations. It feels to me that the United Nations has been down that road a great number of times before. I mean, you yourself were present in Somalia. You were present in Rwanda. The United Nations failure in Srebrenica comes to mind. There seem to have been a lot of conflicts around the world where UN intervention did not prevent terrible things from occurring, where possibly even peacekeepers were responsible for doing criminal actions. And there seem to be a lot of cases where, Liberia comes to mind for me, where peacekeeper presence pauses a conflict, but everybody understands in the country that those peacekeepers cost money and their mission expires at a certain date, and at that date many of those peacekeepers, or all of those peacekeepers, are going to be withdrawn, and at that point the conflict can simply continue where it left off previously. So no lasting stability has been brought to the country. It just paused the conflict temporarily. So it feels to me like the United Nations would have gone through this process a large number of times and would have critically had to evaluate, why did we fail to prevent these things? Like, if we have all these resources, if we have all of these countries, we have all this legitimacy and authority and respect, why did we fail to prevent these terrible things from occurring? Do you feel, when you were doing your report, that you were covering new ground and it was mostly new mistakes that had been made, that had not been made by the United Nations before, nobody could have predicted them? Or do you feel that a lot of what you were covering in your report was lessons that could have been and should have been learned from previous incidents over the last half century of the UN's operations, and had just not actually been implemented?
Yeah, definitely the latter. Huh? Yeah. No, there was nothing new. I think to make the situation, I mean, you say, of course, that listening to me say these things is disheartening, but I would say, this is the real world. What I'm sharing is a reality check. So, but what makes it worse is that you remember that? So I did the Sri Lanka report. And then in 2017-19, you had the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, and another sort of failure of the UN, and an exceptional individual, Gert Rosenthal, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Guatemala, very distinguished person, was commissioned by this Secretary General to do a review of what had happened in Myanmar on the Rohingya crisis. And basically what he wrote was, actually, I don't need to write a report. The only thing you need to do is to read the Sri Lanka report, because it's exactly the same systemic failure of the organization. So yeah, no, it's very serious. Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, but it's I mean, yeah, I mean, one should be shocked, one should be outraged, and one should want to do something about it, because I really think that, what you're right, it's all a series of consecutive failures, and but that I think is the real world, the human nature, the egoism, the of and sort of the strength makes right, or might makes right. But one should never forget that what the UN, even in its current state, the UN represents the illusion of what should be, the illusion of what should be the moral standards, of international moral standards. And I say maybe I say illusion, but that's a little bit like your disheartened thing. I think we should, there is the sense, as long as there's the UN, you and I can have a discussion like this, because as long as there's the UN, you're going to be horrified by the fact that there isn't a more ethical, more morally, morally supported intervention. That there isn't sort of something better. If there was no UN, there would be no reason for us to have this discussion. So and that's, for me, comes to the point that we have to save the UN. There has to be, there has to be a collective, there has to be collective action to get the UN to set itself at the correct moral level, moral standards.
And I Yeah, and I definitely get that. I want to also focus within the scope of what the United Nations has been doing. I want to look at Article 99 as that arose at the end of last year. And I know that you've also described this as a particular. I know I'm just piling onto the United Nations right now, and I promise that I'm going to pile onto individual nations after this. I don't want it to seem like a hate on the UN party, but but I do think that this is also a very salient point that should be brought up. Can you talk us through what Article 99 actually does?
Yeah, I mean, when we discussed it before, I mean, the point I was raising with Article 99 is how it was a missed opportunity for the Secretary General to position the UN at a higher moral level. Basically, Article 99 is an article that allows the Secretary General to convene an exceptional meeting of the Security Council when he believes that that there's a threat to international peace and security, that the world order is being threatened, and he very correctly triggered, and it's only been triggered 7 or 8 times in the history of the UN. So it's a very little used instrument. So when the Secretary General triggered Article 99, it was a very significant moment. And this was the moment when he could have made an impassioned plea for what was happening to world order, where the fact that we are looking at the emergence of the double standards, the notion when you look at response to Ukraine, local response to Gaza, how there was a growing sense of double standards emerging, how already then the rules based order was eroding. There was increasingly, we were entering a world where there was no where international rules were being flouted, that international instruments that were there to help create stability and protect were being ignored. So he could have made a speech that would have focused very strongly on those elements, and to say that was that in already, and in December it would have had huge impact. That was the risk to international peace and security. Instead, he made reference to those elements, but he basically enveloped them in a presentation of the humanitarian situation in Gaza and the risks that were being faced by the population in Gaza, which was very correct. But for me, it was a missed opportunity. In a way, why convene Article 99 if you're going to give a humanitarian briefing that Martin Griffiths, who was the head of the emergency relief coordinator, could have just as well have given. So it was a huge missed opportunity. I think what probably influenced the Secretary General or his entourage is how strongly the Israelis had hit him at the beginning of the conflict, I think in October, November, and how they really targeted him and targeted the UN. And as a result, and I guess a number of other member states were of the permanent five were very uncomfortable with the Secretary General raising the visibility of the implications of what was happening, and they probably put a lot of pressure on him to water down his speech when he made it in December, which is really an incredible shame, because this was really the moment for the Secretary General and the UN to stand up firm and to say very strongly, this is the risk to the world. This is the way the world is going. And it would have almost been prophetic, because it's exactly where we are right now. We're all waiting. I'm talking to you from Amman, Jordan. we're all waiting for an Iranian response to an assassination, Israeli assassination, and we're all waiting with fear that this is going to trigger, a regional conflict. So had he made that very, very strong statement in December, he would have positioned the UN at a very, very high level in terms of, defining what were the moral and ethical standards that the international community should be living up to.
And it feels that this comes back to the phrase that you were using before, which is the fairy tale of the West. And it, I'm trying to sort of grasp it because in some instances you seem to be saying, well, it's a fairy tale and we have to be realistic and we have to understand that the world as it exists today does not have these white knights. It does not have actors, whether they're national actors or whether they're supranational actors, who genuinely are willing to sacrifice and to take a stand on the same principles that they, give speeches about and that they, claim to be champions of. But simultaneously, you seem to be sort of saying that the United Nations should lean into the fairy tale and should say, well, but this is the world as it ought to exist, and this is the moral standard that we ought to have, even if the United Nations doesn't necessarily have the power and the means to enforce it directly. It should at the very least lean into the image to say, well, this is the standard, this is the beacon that you should be following, and if you're not following it, at the very least we can call you out and we can criticize you for having failed to do that. So I'm wondering, like, where do you really see the United Nations and the sort of the leading powers in the world? Do you think that what ought to be happening is that they should be taking a much more direct, much more involved role and doing things like, interventions, as we spoke about with R2P? Or do you think really the role should just be scale it back and just try to set a moral standard, try to call people out for the things that they're doing that are wrong, but recognize, the world in which we live, for what it is, and not rely on this idea of saying, well, we ought to have the ability to stop you from doing these.
Yeah. I mean, I like the way you sort of raise the contradictions in what I've been saying. I mean, the UN is a fairy tale organization. It's been constructed to give some credibility to a fairy tale, and that's why it has to be preserved. It has to be protected. Um, I when I when in Rwanda during the genocide, there was a point. I mean, it was really intense, and there was a point where towards the end of May, early June, the killings continued, and you really didn't see hope. Especially the Security Council was paralyzed. Rwanda, the genocidal government, was on the Security Council, so they were able to define international action. So it was really, really desperate. And I remember meeting a father, Father Vieko, a priest, at some point in the middle of Rwanda, because you could travel. I mean, as long as you weren't Belgian, you could actually move around fairly easily in Rwanda while the killings were going on. And so when of course, there weren't many vehicles traveling. So when you saw a car coming in your direction and it was a foreigner, then you would stop and you would sort of share with each other what the barriers were like. What were the people drunk? Were there kids? So you'd get a sense of what you were moving towards. And I remember, and Father Vieko, you and I used to cross paths quite a lot. And then I remember one point, and then afterwards you do a little bit of small talk. And so I asked Father Vieko at one point, I said, Father, how do you keep going? I mean, this is such a desperate, such a, despairing situation. And of course, when I said that, I thought, well, he's going to talk about his faith. But he said, no, he said, if you believe in something, you believe that something needs to be done, and you believe it very strongly that it's the right thing to do. He said, never stop. You never know. You may be the person in the middle of a dark desert that holds a torch that will allow somebody else, that will guide somebody else to accomplish what you are trying to accomplish. So the reason why I think the fairy tale, the UN, the institutional fairy tale that the UN represents is so important is because of Generation Z. It's because of this younger generation of fighters that I saw in Myanmar, the revolutionaries who are committed to changing. It's, even though many of them have been overwhelmed and destroyed, it's the movements that came out of the Arab Spring. This young generation of people who believe that a better world is possible. And I think to have a fairy tale institution like the UN is essential to help guide them in the belief that it is something possible. If you didn't have this fairy tale institution, which is the UN, it would be darkness. It would be a barbarian world where might dominates. But as long as you have this belief that and it's an institution, it's an institutionalized fairy tale. As long as it's institutionalized, it gives it greater credibility. When I was mentioning fairy tale before, it was a lot more linked to Western governments' responses. The fairy tale that when South Sudan became independent, that all of the issues were going to be resolved. That there was no problem. The big problem was the North and South, but not realizing that it wasn't a fairy tale. The emergence of Southern Sudan, there's some really deep, ingrained tensions that emerge. The fairy tale that Aung San Suu Kyi could lead the country, when there were so many tensions. I think as an iconic person, Aung San Suu Kyi is revered by all, but her period, as a politician, was not necessarily very successful, and yet some Western governments didn't find the interest or the force to try and help guide her, give her political insights in leading the country between 2015 and 2020.
Yeah. So I think I get what you're saying, right? It's almost like the light in the darkness, right? The symbolic value and power of having that beacon. And I think as we've spoken about the United Nations failures in Myanmar, I think this is a good opportunity to talk about the light in the darkness within Myanmar itself. And that is coming in the form of course, the revolutionary forces and as we're going to be discussing, the various forms of self-governance that have been established, and proof positive and demonstration that the people are able to appoint leaders for themselves, and that governance of the people by the people is very much a reality that can be implemented if the willpower is there. And to that end, I want to discuss the journey that you took. So you, as I said, you went into Karenni State, and again, for those who are interested, the article is entitled "A Journey into Rebel-Held Myanmar," which is a brilliant read, I should say. First and foremost, I just want to commend you on this. Karenni, as you know because you were there, but as many of our listeners might not be aware, mountainous, very mountainous, not particularly well developed. Traversing a state like that is quite a taxing physical ordeal. So I think it is very, very commendable that you decided to go in and throw yourself, not just metaphorically but very physically, into this incredibly dangerous but also grueling task. So I first just want to ask, how did that come about? How did you decide that, yes, I want to sneak into a rugged, underdeveloped, internet isolated war zone to see this for myself?
Well, it came out of basically a year and a half. So early last year, 2023, I went up to the border in along the border to Chiang Mai, Mae Sot, because a number of friends, Myanmar friends, Mon, were they were refugees, and they really needed to get asylum because they were really under threat. Um, uh, and so I went up to try and see how I could help them. And while I was up there, I mean, a number of things struck me. I mean, the first was really getting a sense of how little humanitarian aid was actually reaching the non SAC controlled areas. And then the other thing that really fascinated me was starting to get a sense of how, because the SAC were losing ground or losing their ability to actually move into areas or evolve into areas. You saw emerging new forms of governance. Either the ethnic armed group administrations were getting stronger or more autonomous, but you also saw new forms of governance emerging. And Karenni was mentioned to me. So then, when I came out, I wrote an article with somebody from the World Bank, Scott Guggenheim, who's long history in Afghanistan and also in Aceh, in which we argued that a new form of intervention needed to be considered. That when you looked at situations like Myanmar, where the regime was considered illegitimate by the West, and that Myanmar was not an outlier, because a study was done by Chatham House and New York University that found that 50% of populations living in contexts of conflict were living in situations where the authority was considered illegitimate. So when you looked at these situations, and of course the West withdraws all of its structural aid and they turn to humanitarian aid, you're limited in what you can do with the humanitarian lens, because the essence of humanitarian intervention is the ability to negotiate access. And negotiation is based on a give and take. And if you're not allowed to give because the regime's considered rogue, then there's not much access. And then we went on to argue that what we need to appreciate is that communities are resilient, and that in many cases you have new forms of local governance that emerge, and that the international community should be willing to take the risk to understand these new forms and actually invest in them and work with them. And so then I did. So the article in DevX was well received. I was in Washington. I went to different governments and talked, and the response was very positive. Yeah, very interesting. But I knew that it was, but it was the discussions were actually fairly superficial, because I was really, I was able to pitch it in a theoretical way without anything concrete, and I knew that the minute I stepped out of the door, the whole conversation would dissipate. So then I decided that the only way I could really maybe break through would be to actually go inside and to have a look. And so that's what I did. Spent 1 week sort of in the Karenni 5th Brigade area, in a way getting sort of acclimatized, and then a month just in moving around Karenni, so Loiko, Demozo, and then different areas, having looking at getting a better sense. And 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 what and what I went in with fairly clear expectations. So one was went in to try and get a better sense of how much ground the SAC had actually lost, and the second was looking at what were these new forms of governance. In terms of how much ground the SAC had lost, I mean, I came out not with the belief that the resistance is controlling 60 or 70% of the country, but more with the sense that the SAC no longer has access, physical access to 60, I think 60 something, 62% of the country. But they are still present through the shelling, the mortaring, the drones, the spotter planes. So they still instill that sense of real fear among the population. I was caught up in three such attacks. It was heartbreaking to see the fear on people's faces as they rushed into the shelters, but it was extraordinary to see them come out of the shelters with even greater anger towards the SAC. They are not being, this is not cowing them to the military. So much so that, well, anyway, so there was that. The local governance bit, the governance bit was fascinating because you really do have a civil society driven form of governance emerging in Karenni, with the interim executive council, the Karenni KSCC, Karenni State consultative council or committee. So you really have a participatory form of governance emerging. The one thing I hadn't expected that really became, struck me was the Generation Z, this new generation of activists who have come and they've completely transformed the socio-political landscape of Myanmar. This is a generation that has its own language, that, cultural language, that has its own music, that is completely interconnected. In a way, the generation, the people I saw, the activists I saw, have more in common with the young from other parts, even other parts of the world, because they're interconnected with other parts of the world, than they do with their parents. They are they and they are, yeah. And it was fascinating to see the energy, the commitment, the fact, many of them, university educated doctors, teachers, the civil disobedient movement people, seeing the hospitals that have been built destroyed because the hospitals, markets, schools, are targets of military SAC military operations. And seeing them, I met one group that was into its fourth hospital. They were rebuilding the fourth hospital deeper into the jungle. It was extraordinary to see this new generation of activists. In fact, one of the doctors I saw told me, you need to understand that this is no longer a civil war. This is a revolution. And you really got that sense. That was really, really interesting to see.
And I do specifically want to talk about, I mean, multiple things that you've just raised, but one of the ones that stood out to me when I was reading the Noema article is this hospital. So the way that you described it, here you've said they're on their fourth hospital. The way it's described in the article is that the reason they're on their fourth hospital is because active hospitals with patients and medical staff are being targeted by the military and are being shelled. And as you say, literally and metaphorically, they dust themselves off, pick up what survivors they can, and move a little bit further away and establish a new field hospital. That seems to be the cycle. Now that it just really stayed with me when I read it, because it's one of those things that just seems too barbaric to have been an accurate representation of reality. That it's just something that is just so unconscionable on the surface of it. So can you talk a little bit more? I'm just fascinated and horrified at the same time, and I just want to understand a little bit more about what was in the original article was a relatively short paragraph, but I feel I need to understand more about that situation.
Yeah, no, it's exactly as you've presented it. Yeah, this is it's. I think the group's called Spring Hope. It's some young doctors who have come together from different ethnic groups, but coming in, they fled. I think most of them had been trained in Yangon, maybe some in Mandalay, and they've been building. They've first built a hospital fairly, or they moved into a space that was a clinic and transformed it into a hospital. It was, I think it was rocketed. There was an airstrike that destroyed it. They moved to another place, went deeper into the jungle. That was again, I think it was either shelled, after a spotter plane went over, or mortared. And there again, they did that again, two more times, and moving deeper into the jungle and hiding. I mean, now, of course, the one of the interesting phenomenons also that I saw in Karenni is the, given, this notion of a revolution means that everybody's involved in the revolution in different aspects. So you do have and most of the support coming to the revolution, or what's going on in Karenni, comes either from local donations, so local people, or from the diaspora. So most of the money comes from the people themselves, either inside or outside the country. So in a way, the groups and the people make no distinction between providing support to the IDPs, because 80% of the population of Loiko and Demoso are hiding in the jungle. So the activists and the solidarity among the people, provide support to the more destitute IDPs, because they're IDPs also who still have resources or set up small businesses. You have microeconomies that are set up. But but these same groups do also provide support to the fighters, to the fighters who are, fighting the SAC, and of course food, material, whatever, and of course they take care of the wounded. But the situations are becoming so complicated that now doctors are forced to set up two different types of hospitals. One for the wounded fighters, and they do also treat surrendering SAC prisoners, and another one for the general civilian population, because the fear, and that's fear born from experience, is if they treat both in the same area, the risk that the SAC will learn the location of the hospital is very high. Either you have infiltrators, spies who come, or just people who are so happy and so what's the word, grateful for the service they provided. A young wife, woman, difficult childbirth, gets the baby, it's celebrated, and in the celebration through social media, there's mention of the extraordinary work of the hospital. So now what they're doing is most of these doctors are setting up two very distinct hospitals: one for the frontline troops and the prisoners of war, and another one for the civilian population.
Mm. And just one thing that you said in that just really stood out to me in a very negative way. Like when you said everyone's involved, and it's maybe it's the fact that I'm European and I come with a very specific history. But just when you say that phrase, everyone's involved, it immediately takes me to the concept of total war, which of course we unfortunately experienced in World War II. And it's just, it's such a horrifying concept. And again, like as you're saying now, the need to set up separate medical facilities designated for civilians, because it's just a risk. It's just a part of life that the military does not care. They're not going to not bomb a site just because there are civilians there. Like I was going to ask, and then I thought, wait, what would be the point of asking this? Are the resistance groups painting red crosses on the tops of the hospitals, or are they painting the shield of the Geneva Convention on the tops of their hospitals to designate them as protected facilities? But it occurs to me that it wouldn't matter if they did, because the military, even if they do recognize the significance of these symbols, would not care and would probably use these symbols to guide their ordnance onto these onto these facilities. So it's just a very harrowing
Yeah,
situation on the ground.
well, it's out there. No, it's worse. I mean, the reason why they don't put the crosses and is because they would become immediate targets. No, the SAC, because that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to discourage, get cow the population into submission, and so they're targeting hospitals. So if there was a cross, they would attack they become an immediate target. They target churches. They target markets, so that's why markets are all under the jungle. They target schools. No, it's a strategy. It's a blatant strategy of the SAC to target in order to break the spirit of the people, and that's not working. And I agree with you. I think, I mean, when I was talking to one of the groups, in Karenni, I was telling them, you guys, maybe you should actually separate the work you're doing for the IDPs, the support you're giving the IDPs, from your support to the frontline troops, the combatants. And I was told that that's impossible. He said, because there is, the people who are giving us the money, they make no distinction. Actually, the majority of the people who give us the money actually want us to help the combatants, because it will help defeat the SAC. But they was, and so he was saying that it's impossible to make that distinction. If you say, yeah, all out war, that's what the SAC is doing, is all out war. I think you could say all out resistance to the fighting, and that's the notion. In a way, I think that defines what this doctor told me: the difference between a civil war and a revolution. A civil war, is insurgencies. It's much, and you can have people who stay out of the civil war. You have the which is awful word, but you have sort of within inverted commas, the collateral damage. The civilians caught up in a civil war. But when you're in a revolution, it's everybody resisting this aggression, and actually a situation where the common enemy, the SAC, bonds people together, which then, I mean, it's a whole different discussion, because then you have the fact that when in fact, I was telling some of these, especially some of the KNDF people, the Karenni Nationalities Defense Force, and some of the doctors and the rest, and I said, you may not realize it, but you're actually living the best years of your life, the best moment of the conflict, because the moment the SAC is defeated, this bond, the common, the bonding that this common enemy brings, disappears, and then you're going to have a lot of, you'll have a lot of simmering tensions that are going to reemerge. And that's why, for me, the IEC, the Interim Executive Council, is so important. The setting up of this sort of local governance structure is very important, because it needs to be in place to be able to manage these underlying tensions that are going to emerge afterwards.
And I mean, they definitely are like that. I'm sure it's a really big topic that we're going to have to breach, because there's no other way around it. But before we get into the concept of sort of federalism and balkanization, all these other discussions that are being had in the periphery, I think it would be good if we do talk about the IEC and the KSCC, and just generally the way that governance is being handled, because I think Myanmar has been characterized, and I think you're definitely in a much better position to pass judgment on this. Myanmar has been characterized as this conflict as a series of firsts. We have a government in exile that is in the country. They're not in exile. They're an opposition government that has been created during a conflict inside the country and continues to operate within the country and has established itself in parts of the country and is providing services to the people. We also have never before seen levels of cooperation and collaboration between armed groups, some of which are and some of which are not directly organized beneath the national unity government. In Karenni, it's not organized by the NUG. And of course, we have the emergence of a lot of local governance, which is not unique to Myanmar. We've seen similar things in Kurdish territories, for example. But it is quite remarkable the way that you can have basically peaceful administration and effective administration in many parts of the country that are otherwise suffering from an ongoing conflict, are suffering from shortages of essential necessities, food, drinking water, medical supplies, shelter, and so on. So can you talk us through like how were these organized these governing bodies brought into existence, and what is it that they're actually providing to the people?
Okay, well, I would flip what you just said around,
Okay.
and I would say that what you have are strengthened local structures, regions. So you have, the ethnic armed groups are much stronger, and they've developed even stronger autonomy. You have Karenni, which is fascinating because you have a new form of participatory governance that's been put in place, also very, very autonomous. And then you have what's happening in the north and the rest. So what you have is a mosaic of much stronger autonomous components. And okay, and 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 it's and so you have the elements of a new form of federalism, almost like a bottom-up form of federalism. What you have in Myanmar today are two different concepts of governance. You have one concept that is very much, and there are a number of Western donors thinking that way. The NLD thinks that way, which is one where you need to reestablish a central government, and then the central government will devolve power to the regions. That's the way you need to do it. You have another view, which is no, you have this mosaic of strong autonomous areas, and they need, coming out of their structure should be some sort of federalizing central authority. And these are, I think I would say that the first approach enters the fairy tale area. The second approach is basically reality. I think what has happened after the coup on the 1st of February 2021 is that the center has imploded, and the country has fragmented. The SAC has lost its ability to control the country. Replacing the SAC with an NUG NLD structure, without fundamentally changing sort of the elements of the constitution and the rest, will not work. I mean, that train has left the station, and so when you go into the points you made, I think it's just reality. The NUG is no, it's the local structures that are providing the services to the people. They are the key providers of support to the populations they control. The NUG is able to provide some assistance, but they're absolutely not the dominant force on the ground. They have within them deputy ministers who are very much representative of their regions, their areas, who are part of the NUG, but are very much attuned to what's happening in the areas they come from, their areas of origin, but they are not the masters of what's happening in the area. The fighting is not done by the NUG. The NUG is supporting the fighters. The fighting is done by the forces on the ground, some of which are directly affiliated to the NUG, others that are willing to be part of the NUG movements, but this revolution is not being managed by the center because the center no longer exists, and there is no longer space for the center. That is yesterday's game, and we see it in many other countries. Somalia. When I resigned from the UN in end of 2010, for 2 years I was advisor to the president of Somalia, Sheikh Sharif, in Mogadishu. And I was part of an effort to try and project, Sheikh Sharif's authority in the rest of the country. But basically, I mean, it was destined to fail from the beginning, because Sheikh Sharif represented one clan, the rest of the country had other clans. Why would another part of the country that had already developed its own autonomy, why would they be willing to subjugate themselves to Sheikh Sharif's clan? It just didn't make sense, And clan warfare has been quite active in Somalia. It's the same thing in Myanmar. These are, the Karenni, the KSCC, the IEC, they are really developing a fascinating form of local governance. Why would they subjugate themselves to Naypyidaw? What does Naypyidaw have to offer them? Why would they wait for Naypyidaw to offer them the recognition that they already have? I mean, Naypyidaw has absolutely nothing to offer them, as in terms of recognition and support. They have their support. One of the things I wanted to get a sense of is, to what extent was what we were seeing and the IEC, the KSCC, very committed to finding common ground with all of the forces on the ground. So the KSCC and the IEC, they're constituted, but they've left senior positions open for groups to join, groups that they're still trying, or for political or ethnic groups that they're still trying to encourage to join. So the space is there for them. Very, very aware of the tensions that the simmering tensions that are currently simmering, inter-ethnic, intra-ethnic tensions. I think one of the things about these activists and revolutionaries coming over, it is this younger generation Z. In the future, I would not be surprised if there aren't tensions between the local communities and this generation Z. But again, these are tensions that have to be managed. So one of the things I looked at, I wanted to get a sense of, is whether what I saw in Karenni was an outlier, a one-off. And so, so I spent some time in Thailand after coming out, and then I've been in touch with quite a few groups. And the sense I'm getting is that there's a lot of interest by other groups in what's happening in Karenni. The form of participation in the establishment of the administrative structures. Getting buy-in from the population in the structures that are being set up. I think it's interesting to other groups, because groups are seeing they need to transit from a military form of administration, or an administration that's heavily dominated by armed groups, to something that's much more participatory, where communities are much more involved in the establishment of the administrations, so that they become much more accepting of the governing authority. I think groups see that not only in the areas they've traditionally controlled, some of them are more advanced in that than others, but also given that many of these groups are now in control of areas where they've never been in before. And so this IEC model is a good way to try and get the population to accept their presence, to get them to participate in their governance. There are different levels of adoption. Certain groups, I think the Karen KNU, very interested, very focused, looking at how they can They can, set up an IEC type consultative structure. Actually, they have the elements of one, but they have their seven brigades, 7 districts. They have many different forces. Others are planning. They're looking at setting up the conditions for a consultative council type structure that they propose to roll out in 2025. So there's some really interesting discussion between groups, and the IC is very open to try and share their experiences with the other groups. So basically, what you have is the emergence of a new form of governance, a new dynamic that is appearing in Myanmar, but the one which is strengthening and inserting itself into this mosaic of autonomous areas that has not emerged, as you said, it has always existed, but has been strengthened since the 1st of February 2021.
And I find it interesting what you said in inverting my approach. The way you've described it is very bottom up, that it's very locally driven, very people driven, and I think that bodes well for the concept of federalism. That bodes very well for having structures in place. As you say, we're getting people used to the IEC, getting people to think, okay, well, this works for us. This is fine. But I'm wondering at the same time, because this is the balancing act, isn't it? In any federalism situation, what is the balance to be struck between having central authority and having localized self-determination? Because it seems right now, the way that you're describing it, it seems to me like the tendency is much more towards local self-determination, devolution of power. And do you think that could have negative ramifications, assuming the Tamado is unseated, assuming that we enter into the next chapter when we try to establish the new character in law and constitution of Myanmar? Do you think that having all of these different groups who have established, a political presence, but now, as you're saying, also popular support in their local regions, could undermine hopes for the retention of a unified and somewhat centralized Myanmar?
Yeah, no, that's definitely the risk. Huh? I mean, those are the tensions that have to be dealt with. But I think the risks will be realized if there's an attempt to reestablish a strong central government, which is a little bit, what the NLD is pushing, the NUG NLD part is pushing, believing that, they are the legitimate government, having won the elections, which is true, but the situation is fundamentally changed. And if donors insist on a quick fix, because the quick fix to the what's currently going on, which is replacement of the SAC by some sort of construction that includes the NUG NLD. I think what's fascinating about Myanmar is that it's in the midst of its own transformation. And what's very, very important for the international community is to respect that and to give space and to allow what's happening to develop, and to engage in a very humble and facilitating way, not to try and mediate anything, to facilitate. And the reason I say that is because so I think Myanmar, the reason I'm aside from, but one of the things that I'm really fascinates me about Myanmar and why I'm invested in trying to understand it is because I think Myanmar has lessons to give to other parts of the world. And so the more we can understand these dynamics, this bottom-up approach, as you say, the more we can be aware of the challenges of the balancing act, because there are very, very serious risks. But what's interesting now is no single group is calling for independence. They're much more focused on their autonomy. And so there's space for dialogue, there's space for reflection. The importance is to give the groups the opportunity. The fact that the IC is engaged with discussions with the TNLA, the KNU, the Sagaing Forum, and others in terms of sharing their experiences, we should be facilitating and supporting that, rather than come in with our own models. The reason I say that is a lesson from the period of the ceasefires. For me, what was the 2012 to 2015, what was fascinating for me, was realizing, it was going in, and especially among the Karen, and seeing how they were embracing the opportunity of these ceasefires. I went out into the jungle, spent nights with the IDPs hiding in the jungle, and it was fascinating to see how much hope and how, the fact that fighting had stopped, how much relief it was bringing, and at the time, there were a lot of these foreign mediation people coming, and they would come in, and because I was one of the people who was being asked to set up, I would have discussions with them, and what I would tell them is, don't do anything, just observe. I said, this is the most fascinating, this is such a unique opportunity for us to understand how peace or the elements of stabilization actually can come about, because the people hiding in the jungle want it, and of course completely ignored, so much so that I started calling these groups the mediation vultures, because they just came in and they just wanted to impose, the Northern Ireland model. This is how we resolved it in Northern Ireland. Then no, this is how we resolved it in Colombia. And they were just imposing their models, which were not at all, they were instructive in terms of giving some guidance, but they weren't adapted to the situation in Myanmar. But more importantly, what these mediation vultures were doing is they were taking people out of the process for site visits and trainings elsewhere. So people who were essential to the success of the ceasefires were being taken out in order to be lectured at by all of these very sort of high level and influential analysts. That's what I fear. That's what I think must not happen in Myanmar today. One of my fears is that the IEC and the KSCC, the structure, becomes a donor darling, and that donors just flood in. They take them out, and they flood in. This is how we do it in Switzerland. This is federalism in Switzerland. No, this is federalism in Germany. This is how we do federalism in Germany. No, we've got a federal structure in the US. This is how we do it in the US. And that they just take people out on site visits. You go around, have a look at how it's working, go to trainings and stuff, and they completely undermine what's happening right now in Myanmar. That is my greatest. If I were to have a fear, my greatest fear is that we are going to be the instruments of screwing this up.
And I mean, I take that point, and I understand that a careful balance has to be struck, with with regards to how much intervention and how much of a role external experts can have. But do you not think that there is the opposite possibility as well, that without that intervention, because federalism itself is not a new concept. We have many federal systems, as you say, like Russia and the US and Canada and Switzerland and Australia and so on. So we have many federal systems in the world, and they're all different, they're all unique. And in the Myanmar context, I think federalism is going to be much more complicated, because most of the federal systems that we have in the Western world evolved in a very different way. But at the same time, because it's such a unique situation, and because Myanmar is such a complex country in terms of inconsistent levels of development, in terms of culture, in terms of language, in terms of religion, in terms of long-standing tensions between different stakeholder groups, do you not think that if we step back completely, if external people step back completely, people who maybe have studied this for a very long time, and do not come in and say, hey, the system that you're proposing in this document is not likely to succeed, and we know that because of case study, that we may also be doing a disservice by allowing people to run into a constitutional structure that is going to collapse within, a decade or half a century, because there are some glaring flaws and there are some major questions that you can look at and you can say, hey, if these questions are not answered in the Constitution today, it's going to come down to a constitutional challenge decades from today, and the outcome of that challenge might trigger resentment towards the system. It might trigger breakaway movements, whatever that case may be. Do you not think that we have to be conscious of both ends of the spectrum of over involving ourselves, but also of taking too much of a step back?
No, I mean, definitely. I definitely agree with you. No, I'm not saying take a step back. I'm quite the contrary. I'm saying the word I'm looking for is humility. To have the humility to come in and help, offer support, help, help facilitate, but not be directive and not impose one, not take ownership for what's happening on the ground. And the problem is, a lot of these groups, these mediation groups, they need to claim ownership because it's their way of getting funding. So they need to be able to say, we are the key elements in this process, because that's how they get funding from donors. And what I'm saying is, you don't want to do that. You don't want to you need to come in with a level of humility. You need to offer advice. You need to facilitate interactions. Yeah, you need to offer whatever guidance you can, but not be directive, huh? Not impose a model, because we're looking, the dynamics are very different. The socioeconomic conditions, the dynamics are very, very different, and that's so one needs to guarantee or preserve sort of the local ownership of the process, and encourage it. But no, so I totally agree with what you're saying. What I'm mentioning is sort of one step up, where we start imposing. It's basically white people who come and dictate how they view the situation should be managed. I think we mustn't allow that to happen. And in a way, I think it's the NUG. It's the role of the NUG to do this. It's the role of the NUG, rather than focusing on, we need to get to Nepido in order to devolve authority. No, I think the NUG needs to look at what sort of structure should we think about when the revolution is won.
Although that alone raises an important question, because you say, well, the NUG should be the one doing it, and I would support that. I think they're the front runner in this race. The NUG has the best possible chance. It has the most size. It has the most legitimacy, the most recognition, and so on and so on and so forth. But the to take it back to realpolitik, the NUG is not in possession of the majority of the guns. And there are a lot of organizations around the country that are very pointedly not the NUG. They are not organized under the NUG. They do not follow the instructions of the NUG. They're very independent, and they're very proud of the fact that they have existed for a very long time, that they have provided services to their people. The KNU comes to mind. The KIA comes to mind. The Arakan Army, for all of the things that they have done that we criticize them for very appropriately. They have existed for quite some time. They have significant power. They have significant pull. These organizations, it seems to me that if the NUG steps up and says, hey, we are going to take this lead in determining how federalism can and should work, it seems that a lot of these organizations might be in a situation to turn around and say, well, hang on, who decided that you can take the lead on that? Federalism is all of us involved, or we all have to agree to the terms of federalism. We all have to agree how much power we give up.
That's exactly what the NUG must not do. The NUG must not come in, because they don't have the legitimacy of the ground. They mustn't go in and say, and they mustn't go in and act as if they were one of these mediation groups. and to say, here we've come in, we no, what the and I've talked to some of the NUG ministers, and I said, this is your opportunity to contact the different groups and to ask them what they would expect of a central government. So this is the moment for the NUG to try and sort of investigate what could potentially be their role in a new Myanmar, rather than come in and assert, this is what our role is going to be because we won the elections in 2020. That's yesterday's game. There's too much blood that's been spilled. Too many people have died, and the Generation Z and the others, they've moved on. They're no longer there. So it's really an opportunity for the NUG humility to come in and say, okay, contact the groups. What would you see as being an added value from Nepido? So that's what I mean in the sense that the NUG should take the lead. The NUG should take the lead in thinking through, in developing, in discovering what could be the construction of this federal state.
And obviously, being conscious of what you've said, that we don't want to get into this territory of white saviors coming in and determining it. But just because Myanmar is such a complex and unique case, and especially given the region, right? Like when we look at most of the countries in Asia, they tend away from federalism. I think Malaysia would be an exception to that. India's quite complicated as well, but by and large, they do tend towards, as much as possible, much more centralized systems. Do you have an idea of what federalism could look like or would look like? Because we have a lot of options to draw from. There are religious lines, there are ethnic lines, there are cultural lines and linguistic lines, but many of those are blurred, many of those overlap, many of those would turn into thousands of enclaves and exclaves. We could go back to, pre-colonial divisions and maps. How do we determine who is large enough to warrant having a subdivision of their own? How do we even begin to approach it? Because, of course, as I said, in the West, most of our federal systems evolved from pre-existing polities that decided to unify and create a federal system. That was the case in Switzerland, that was the case in Canada, that was the case in Australia, that was the case in the United States. Whereas here we're talking about taking a previously centralized polity and radically devolving authority to completely newly created, potentially, federal subdivisions, which I don't know if there's a historical precedent for this to ever have been attempted. So do you have any thoughts on what you think might be an effective way to go about this?
No, of course not.
Oh.
Yeah,
Good times then, okay.
Yeah, because no, of course not. I definitely don't see myself as a white savior. No, but that's part of the challenge. Yeah, I mean that's what's so fascinating. I mean that's. But you have people on the ground who have ideas. You have people within the IEC who have a view on what they would expect. I mean the fact that the people in TNLA, PSDF are laying the ground for the establishment of a future consultative mechanism. I mean, they're thinking these things through. Huh? So that's where but no, I have absolutely no idea. And I so no, I mean that's the challenge, and that's where and it's a huge challenge that the structures in Myanmar have to confront, and we need to be willing to support them in assuming they're taking on the challenge. Yeah. But as you said, you pled in my court. You said this is completely new; it hasn't been done before. That reinforces the point that you should not try and impose any of the other models that have emerged elsewhere.
I mean, yeah, because I don't think that it would be possible or reasonable, and I personally suspect that My suspicion is that the direction that things are likely to go is very much to take the largest existing sort of EAOs and assign ethnic subdivisions that would be associated with them and with their ethnic identities. I suspect that is a likely direction. However, I don't think that that would make for a particularly stable situation. I do think that a radically different approach to federalism, which is not as rooted in the idea that we can draw clear delineations on the ground, which separate Group A from Group B and give them self governance and assume that that is going to fix the problem. I think a radical deviation from this concept is going to be necessary in the Myanmar case, and it's just I really have no idea what that might look like or what that could look like, and I very much want it to succeed. It's just
Yeah,
this is
no,
going to take a lot of careful planning.
yeah, no, I agree. I totally agree. I totally agree. No,
Mm.
that's a huge. I mean, as we, this is, the defeat of the SAC is sort of, yeah, just the first. That's the first step in a very, very complicated journey. On a very, very complicated journey. I totally agree.
The insights that you have, I think, are just incredibly valuable and just very rich. I I want to understand a little bit more about what it was that you saw in Karenni, not so much about governance, but about the people themselves, the conditions that they're in. One thing, for example, in your article that stood out to me as well was when you were talking to Marwa, I think was his name, Marwi, sorry, and he he's telling you that many of the people are feeling frustrated that prisoners are being taken. Because if prisoners are being taken alive from the military, then that means that they have to be housed and they have to be fed, and those resources have to be paid for. And that means that in a circular fashion, the civilians themselves feel that their hard sacrificed donations are being wasted keeping alive military members. That there is this it's stronger than anger. And you were describing previously as well when you saw these bombing attacks that people would be terrified and run and hide, and then when they emerged, their anger had just deepened. That that I think is a very natural and very human response. I wouldn't expect anything different, to be completely honest. But do you have concerns with regards to that? Do you have concerns that this conflict, if it goes on much longer, is going to tip into a point where the resistance is no longer trying to hold the moral high ground? The resistance is no longer trying to uphold the international standards, which they have been doing quite an admirable job of attempting to maintain. They haven't always succeeded, but they have very much been trying to do so. But faced with an enemy like the military, and faced with what you're saying, that there is tension and there is pressure from the population themselves, do you think that there is a possibility that thread is going to tear, and they're eventually going to say, you know what, no more prisoners, that's it, we're done?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I think it was more sort of a reflection or an indication of how much hate there is towards the SAC. And then at the same time, I think it's sort of it shows how much Mari and the KNDF are and the KA are sort of maintaining standards, and so they are taking POWs, they're taking care of them. The IEC, has taken on prisons, the management of police and prisons. So some of the PMWs are being taken care of by the within the IEC prison structures, others within the KNDF prison structures. So they are being served and supported, and so I think these are sort of natural tensions, and I think and it's as much as it brings out how much hatred exists towards the SAC, it also brings out the nobility or the the high ground that the KNDF holds in terms of prisoners. I think I think what has been unleashed in, or what has been released within Myanmar is violence. Yeah, uh, and what also exists in Myanmar is a proliferation of arms. So I'm not sure. Will the revolution lose the moral high ground? The longer this lasts, and not sure. I wouldn't say it would inevitably, but there is violence. But what I do think is that once the SAC is defeated or the revolution is won, I think the management of tensions is going to be a lot more difficult, because of this violence that's been introduced. And violence is a bit everywhere. The assassination of SAC administrators these are, I mean, I'm sure that some of them, or many of them, are nothing more than people who are trying to get money for their families. But the assassination of government administrators, the just the different, the call to assassination, which I don't think was a particularly wise call at the beginning by the NUG, and I think a monster, a small monster, not a genocidal one, but I think a small monster has been unleashed in Myanmar, and the fact that there's so many weapons available and in the general population could translate into difficult to deal with tensions.
I think that proliferation of arms is something that I'm very concerned about. I think a lot of people are very concerned about. And again, coming back to Marwi, the deputy commander of the KNDF that you reference quite a bit in your article, there's that direct quotation that you highlight from him. When you give a soldier a gun to fight, you need to tell him that he needs to know that he will have to give it back.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think that's a very poignant point. And the problem is that most of the experts that I've spoken to, most of the analysts I've spoken to, when I ask them the question, okay, so what's the plan for getting all the guns back after the conflict? Everyone's response is, we have no idea.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
and we don't know what impact this is going to have on the country. So that I think is something that really terrifies me for the future of Myanmar, um, post stability. But I mean, assuming we get to that point, and hopefully we will, and hopefully soon. But that said, in terms of victory and in terms of success, this is a really important point about Karenni. People have said that Karenni is very close. It is possibly the closest federal subdivision to victory currently. That Loiko is likely to become the first state capital in Myanmar that is fully under resistance control. And the possibilities for that are enormous. I think if Karenni fully becomes liberated, that gives us, because it's on the Thai border, that gives us the opportunity to open up a actual genuine humanitarian corridor. And as you note in your interview with Irrawaddy, the Thai government has been engaging with this concept of a humanitarian corridor. Whether they're doing it genuinely or duplicitously, I don't know. And Karenni borders Shan, and Kare borders the KNU territory. So I think the potential would be enormous. The question is, do you think the claims and the reports that we've had that Karenni is likely to be completely liberated and that the final bases in Karenni can reasonably be shut down, leaving us at a point where it's actually quite difficult for the military to airstrike and mortar strike and rocket strike because they don't have any nearby bases of operations? Do you think that those are realistic?
See, I wouldn't really have any basis in which to respond. I mean, I'm not military or anything like that. My understanding right now is that the KNDF has had to withdraw troops from, for example, the university in Loiko, because the SAC reinforced its presence. So I think it's not total control yet. And then of course there's all of the the airstrikes, and You don't. I mean, you just need to give greater capacity to the planes. You won't get rid of them. So I don't know, but yeah, so in that sense, yeah, I wouldn't know how to answer that question. My
And
sense it's not over
yep.
yet. I my
Well,
my sense the fighting's not over yet.
I mean that's an unfortunate reality that I think we're resigned to. But what about the situation of the civilians on the ground? Because a lot of what I heard from Karenni was quite stark. Massive food shortages, nothing but plain white rice, not even potatoes and onions in a lot of places. Plenty of ghost villages, but the military have left mines in a lot of people's houses, so the demining process is slow. Shelling has destroyed the roofs of a lot of buildings, making them completely unsuitable as shelters, particularly with the rainy season approaching. Uh, Generally, the situation that was explained to me by previous guests has been in terms of necessities of life. The situation is abysmal, and in terms of collaboration and coordination and goodwill between revolutionary organizations, whether they're PDF associated or not, is actually surprisingly very strong and very high. Does your experience in Karenni corroborate that?
I mean, I wouldn't. No, I wouldn't say. I mean, I'm right next to Gaza. When you compare it to to the situation in Gaza, I think it's nowhere close. I think it's true that villages. I mean, yeah, the Tatmadaw Sak have planted mines everywhere. So part of the supports that the KNDF needs, they're doing it themselves. And even some of the civil society groups are doing themselves. There's equipment and training for demining. I think that's important. I think people have fled. They fled into the jungle, but what you see emerge are microeconomies. So I would no, I wouldn't. I mean, I didn't see this destitution that is being painted, and in a way, I think it's a slight misrepresentation of what's going on, because it sort of implies that the people are just submissive and passive. But you have, I mean, you have really interesting sort of markets developing along the road, especially from Demoso and going out. You have internet cafes that are being springing up because internet is available with Starlink. Starlink has completely transformed the communications capability. It's accessible. So you have markets, mechanic shops. So you have an economy that's functioning, bread production, the rest. But the longer, and people are living on their reserves. So they're living on their financial reserves or whatever. The longer they're forced to be IDPs, the longer this continues, yeah, the greater the number of people are going to enter the subsistence, um, uh, um, pit, or become much, not pit, but the subsistence category, where they will need support, and where they need support, they need help. Right now, I think it's a sufficiently vibrant economy for some support to get to them, because the numbers are still not the majority. But the moment when the economy is no longer able to sustain the general population and is no longer able to support those in need of subsistence, then I think then it is going to become catastrophic. But painting this as sort of a completely reliant and submissive population, you know, eating grass because they can't, because they've eaten all of the leaves. That's where we're really, really far away from. I mean, what really interested me was the economy that was flourishing. The fact that you could find, and stuff was actually coming even from Mandalay. They were coming from SAC controlled areas. Goods were coming into the Demoso Loiko area. Some were going out, and then of course stuff was coming in from Thailand.
The Thailand doesn't surprise me because I know the border is relatively porous, but it is very interesting because that what you're saying that the goods are being shipped in from SAC controlled territory, that implies that there are people who are able to go into SAC controlled territory, load up a truck, and drive it into resistance controlled territory, and not be assassinated, murdered, exploded, what have you.
I mean, it's high risk, and they need to pay. But yeah, no, it's happening. Yeah. I mean, it's not a walk in the park. Huh? You need to negotiate. You need to pay off. But no, but it's happening. Yeah.
So what is the medium of exchange? Are they still using the Myanmar chat, or what is
Yeah,
the currency?
yeah, Myanmar chat.
Really?
Yeah.
You would have thought it would have lost its stability and been replaced by barter economy or US dollars or
Yeah,
something, but no, okay.
yeah, and you
Interesting.
change. You've got you change the money. You've got money changers.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. And so what are they predominantly do? Because that is shocking to me. Like after the very sort of stark reports that I'd heard of Karenni, it never really occurred to me that there would be, as you're describing it, an economy. So what is it mostly like clothing and foodstuffs and essentials that are being traded for, or are there also non-essential items that people are still interested in acquiring?
Yeah. I mean, well, right now people still have capital. So yeah. So it's a whole bunch. You wood to make furniture. They have, of course, guest houses. Um, they have a lot of basic necessities, food, um, clothes, cement, construction materials. I mean, it's sort of it's a functioning low level economy. That's basically because the people who've been forced out of Loiko and Demoso are are have actually, they've moved. Those who could have moved their assets with them, and some still have access to their warehouses. So they've basically moved. Many have just moved their businesses from Loiko and Demoso and set up temporary shop in on the road, the main road to Cherry Hill, I think it's called.
So in your experience, then, having been around, you were around Loico, you were around Damoso, and you moved around the state. To what extent would you say that normal life is continuing for the civilians? So going to work, buying things in the shops, cooking, going home, spending time with your family, like these types of things that we take for granted. To what extent is that actually the reality for those civilians?
No, it's been completely disrupted. No.
Okay.
I mean, there is no normal life. But what there is that there, because they've all lived through trauma. But what you do have are, you have local economies. You have markets working. I mean, they're not flourishing; they're working. You have different forms of activities. You know, you know, grain mills, flour mills. Sorry.
Okay.
You have a lot of sort of life continues, but it continues in a completely different
Mm,
way.
okay. That's. I mean, it must be an incredible thing to experience. Just to it's almost like a duality of life continues, things have to be done in amongst warfare and devastation. It just, everyone who describes it to me, and I suppose I'm in a very privileged position, never actually having seen warfare firsthand. But everyone who describes it, they make it sound like something that just cannot logically exist. Like two completely incompatible things have just been forced together, and in some sort of abstract pastiche, somehow it happens and it exists. But I just find it very difficult to imagine in my head what it must look like and what it must feel like, and what the energy of these places must feel like when you're there and when you're talking to these people. It must be a very
I mean,
strange and unsettling thing.
it's respecting the fact that people are resilient. They resilient not in the sense that they can sort of just absorb, but more resilient in the sense that they fight. They they don't just sit down and take it. They are trying to to live, but and yeah, to not reestablish their, well, they're trying to reestablish their lives, not without the hope that it's going to return to the way it was before, because it's been massively disrupted. But they are trying um, to reestablish their lives. Of course, I mean, you do have, so that's sort of the general play, but you do have, of course, IDPs who are very destitute, hiding in the jungle, and they are dependent on support. So they get some support. Well, they get quite a lot of, well, they get support, not a lot. They get support from from the local communities, from the organizations that are in place. So they do get they do get some support. But it's true, the longer this lasts, yeah, the more dire the situation is going to become.
Mm. And so ultimately, like, we've covered I think an incredible range of topics, and I think we've looked at the international level and we've looked at the very local level, and I think we've gone through a lot. And I really, really, really appreciate you sharing your insights. I'm sure that we can, delve into any of the topics that we've discussed today and do 2 hours just on that one topic, because there is just such a depth there when it comes to discussing federalism, when it comes to discussing the United Nations, and when it comes to discussing the duplicity of politicians and actors on the world stage. But I'm conscious of your time, and I do think it is an organic place for us to stop. But before we do that, as you may or may not be aware, we always end our episodes by inviting our guests to share some final thoughts for our audience. Anything that you think the audience should consider, any fundamental message that you think that they should carry with them as they go on throughout the day, and maybe discuss what they heard and discuss some thoughts that were raised when they're talking to their friends or to their family. So if you have any message that you would like to spread to them directly, or any thoughts you would like to share with them, I'd invite you to do that now.
Well, I guess, yeah, I guess, I guess my message would be, for people listening who go, never give up. I think what Father Vieko was one who told me that. But then also from what I saw in Myanmar, people are resisting. They're not sitting down. They're not sort of just giving up. No, never give up. If really fight, it's really important to fight. And it's important to understand that as an individual you have responsibility to fight. Don't transfer your sense of responsibility to an organization. Realize that you remain responsible, and you can have an impact. Even if you don't see it, you can have an impact. So my key message is never give up the fight. Really, absolutely never give up the fight.
Many listeners know that in addition to running these podcast episodes, we also run a nonprofit, Better Burma, which carries out humanitarian projects across Myanmar. While we regularly post about current needs and proposals from groups on the ground, we also handle emergency requests, often in matters that are quite literally life or death. When those urgent requests come in, we have no time to conduct targeted fundraisers, as these funds are often needed within hours. So please consider helping us to maintain this emergency fund. We want to stress that literally any amount you can give allows us to respond more flexibly and effectively when disaster strikes. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give in another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Yara Nangaya Unyana Dadu Yadanam Yodigane Zadamana, we got a Besayana, Besayo. Oba Yarananda Dayananga, Yaranaya, Dayanam Boda, Yaranam.